Hello and welcome back to the Eat Real to Heal podcast. This is a show that we created a few years ago to help people understand and learn and be educated about and be inspired about all the information that is out there and available to us on the fact that we can reverse chronic diseases using foods as medicine. Right now, you are listening to a special 9-part series which is part of my dissertation by portfolio for my PhD for Royal Roads University, which I'm just completing now. Now, I've interviewed 9 incredible individuals, participants for this research who agreed to give their time, their knowledge, their bodies, their minds, their spirits to this research. And I want you to welcome Dr. Milton Mills, MD.
This has continued on even post-slavery, that the continued foisting of unhealthy food on communities of color has been a way of keeping people of color in a subjugated state, because if people are unhealthy, they are unable to fight. My mantra is Black lives can't matter until Black health matters. Because if people are sick, if they are taking 1,001 medicines, if their heart is weak, if their blood sugar's out of whack, if they're stroking out every other day, they can't fight for their freedom because they don't have their health. And so, targeting communities of color with these fast food restaurants that, again, sell just grease-laden, salt-laden, unhealthy food that creates disease from day one, is again part of the overall game plan.
Now, Dr. Milton Mills practices urgent care medicine in the Washington, D.C. area, and he has served previously as the Associate Director of Preventive Medicine and as a member of the National Advisory Board for Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. He has been a major contributor to position papers presented by the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine to the United States Department of Agriculture regarding dietary guidelines for Americans. And he has also been the lead plaintiff in PCRM's class action lawsuit that asks for warning labels on milk. Now, that is an important topic that you can dive into, which we will be getting into in this interview. Now, Dr. Mills has published several research journal articles dealing with racial bias in federal nutrition policy. His major focus is in the use of nutritional measures to reduce the risk of major chronic diseases. He frequently donates his time via practicing at free medical clinics and travels widely, speaking at hospitals, churches, community centers throughout the country. And he was featured in a recent attention-getting film called What the Health, which some of you may have seen. And if you haven't, please go out there and watch it. It is a brilliant film. And he will also appear in the film that's coming up soon or might already be out called The Silent Vegan. So Dr. Mills is part of this 9-part series. If you loved what you heard here with Dr. Mills, if this is the first episode you've listened to, please go back and listen to the previous 6 episodes as part of my PhD research. Every participant is going to wow you, blow you away with the information that they're sharing you. They're going to bust open your hearts and your minds and hopefully encourage you to learn more about these topics. I've been researching this for the last 7 years. It is incredibly important knowledge that we need to learn so that we can understand what are all the barriers that exist in remote and rural communities across North America and that prevent BIPOC people, that's Black, Indigenous, people of color, from being able to access the clean, real foods that are needed to prevent, manage, and reverse chronic degenerative diseases. Let's dive in with Dr. Milton Mills. Thank you for being here. And please share this episode with your friends, your loved ones. And it's important that this message gets out. And so you can play an active role in mobilizing this knowledge so that everybody gets to learn about these important topics. Thanks so much to all my listeners for being here. It is always a pleasure pulling these podcasts together for you. I love your feedback. So please go ahead as well and email me your comments, your questions, your feedback. Let me know how we could, what we could do with this information, how we could do it better. I would love to hear all of your thoughts. So email me at nicolette@richerhealth.ca. Thanks so much, and I'll see you at the end of the show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Eat Real to Heal podcast. It is a true honor to have Dr. Milton Mills on our show today. I have been following you, Dr. Mills, for a very long time through all the documentaries that you've been in, all the work that you've been doing. And I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to be part of this very important interview, which is actually an interview for my PhD. So welcome today.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here, and I feel honored that you asked me to be part of your project.
Yes, how could I not? Especially, you really fit, the criteria beyond being an African American doctor working in the United States. But because of your deep, deep, deep thinking into all of the barriers that are, really contributing to the disproportionate rates of chronic disease within Black communities, Indigenous communities, and in communities of people of color. So you have been thinking about this for an extremely long time. This goes far beyond, any vegan movement or plant-based movement. Even, you're huge in that world. But this is a topic that is very dear to my heart. And I was so excited that you and I had the chance to talk a week ago. And we just immediately, within seconds, not ever having spoken before, just like dove deep into such rich topics that I'm hoping you'll bring forth again today. So I just need to let the audience know that this is interview number 7 of my PhD research, where I am conducting podcasts with experts in the field of BIPOC health. And being an expert means that, yes, you might have a medical degree like Dr. Mills, but you might actually have traditional ecological knowledge like my grandmother had, never learned to read or write, never went to school a day in her life, but she knew the science of growing food and health and keeping her community and all the villagers in our community healthy. So it's about including all voices, not just the voices of people who have a certain number of letters after their name. So, Dr. Mills, my research question is, and we're going to get at this from so many different angles.
Sure.
What are the barriers the BIPOC communities face in accessing the quality of foods that are capable of reversing lifestyle chronic degenerative diseases? So lots of pieces to that question. So whatever that brings up for you, I would love you to just hear your response to that.
Oh boy. So, what are the barriers? Well, one of the big barriers, certainly within the United States, has to do with the fact that BIPOC communities have traditionally been utilized as dumping grounds for agricultural excess and at the U.S. agricultural almost detritus in a way. There's been this recurring pattern throughout, certainly, again, American history, and I can't speak for Canada because I don't know Canadian history that well, although given that Canada somewhat follows kind of Western patterns. I suspect it may be similar.
Very similar, yes.
But European nations had a practice of moving into an area where indigenous people lived and taking those people out of their safety zone, out of their cultural milieu, and putting them into a place of food scarcity so that they became dependent on the colonizer for their sustenance. And they replaced the traditional ways of preparing food, acquiring food, and traditional foods with the sort of cast-offs of the Western culture. And those were typically foodstuffs that would create disease in these cultures. So for instance, in the United States, when the Europeans arrived, the Native American nations that were here were actually largely agrarian-based economies, where they had cleared land and were growing crops that the nations have depended on for their sustenance. The Pilgrims were saved not with mountains of dead animals, but they were actually saved with corn and squash and beans. And the wonderful Native American museum in Washington, D.C. has a beautiful display of what they call the Three Sisters, which were the core crops that several of the Native American nations depended on, which were corn, beans, and squash. And these were the crops that they grew, and again, were sustainable, renewable, and provided not only the calories, but again, adequate and appropriate nutrition. But as the Europeans decided that they wanted the land that these nations had, and they began forcing them off the land, they deliberately forced them onto more marginal lands that were more difficult to cultivate, because they wanted them to become dependent on the US government for handouts. And in fact, one of the most egregious examples of this was the what's called the Trail of Tears, which occurred in the early 1800s, where Native American nations in the American Southeast were force marched from areas that would become the Carolinas, Georgia, and northern Florida, and literally force marched all the way out to the Oklahoma territories, which were kind of bitter scrub land that was almost impossible to till and put on these, quote, reservations, with the idea that they were deliberately being placed on land that they could not cultivate. But the other part of that was the reason they were forced off their land was because of the invention of the cotton gin. And the invention of the cotton gin in, I think it was 1808, suddenly made cotton a cash crop. And that meant that slavery became turned cotton into a huge business. And so the planters in the Deep South needed huge tracts of arable land to grow cotton. And guess what? The Native Americans had already cleared that land. They had already removed the trees, removed the rocks. They had plowed it, cultivated it, and the American government stole it from them and forced them off their lands, gave that land to Southern planters to create these cotton plantations, and forced the indigenous peoples to move to these marginal reservations where they were then given these commodity crops, alcohol, sugar, white flour, lard, things, and taught to make things like so-called fry bread that ultimately created endemic diseases like diabetes and problems like alcoholism, because one of the other more insidious aspects of the cultural disruption that occurred when these nations were moved off their lands was that these Native American nations had very complex but very well established matrilineal cultural genealogies, and they were very well established, and much of the knowledge of how to cultivate and propagate these crops were actually known and taught by the women in the nation, and they were the ones who were the repositories of this knowledge and who handed it down. And when the government came in and instead forced this patriarchal way of sort of constructing society, they completely destroyed the cultural lineage and practices of these Native American nations, and just utterly destroyed and disrupted their social fabric and caused the loss of much of the cultural knowledge of how to grow the food that they had been growing for millennia. And then again, forced them to start becoming dependent on this unhealthy, processed, nutrient deficient cast-offs from U.S. agricultural leftovers that ultimately created endemic diseases like diabetes, obesity, alcoholism, and so forth. And so that is the pattern you saw. And when they brought West Africans, literally kidnapped and dragged them over here to become prisoners on these slave labor camps that we euphemistically refer to as plantations, these were every bit as heinous and onerous as Auschwitz, Dachau,
Mhm.
Bergen-Belsen, and all of the hideous, horrible Nazi death camps, work camps that we all look upon as ghastly artifacts of the Nazi regimes from World War II. These were slave labor camps where people were worked to death. And as the West Africans were imprisoned on these slave labor camps, their entire social structure, family structures were again completely disrupted. The cultural knowledge that they had in terms of how to raise the traditional foods that they had typically eaten, which again, in West Africa, they were usually eating a plant-based diet that contained no dairy, was very low in fat, contained lots of legumes, beans, green leafy vegetables, limited amounts of animal foods, and instead they were brought to these prison camps and literally forced to eat the garbage of those prison camps, which is why they were given the entrails of the animals, the hooves of the animal, the pig's feet, the ears, the tails, and so forth. They were given the weeds that grew on the plantation, which is why they ended up being given the collard greens and turnip greens and so forth. Now, turned out that those things were actually the greens, at least, were healthy, but the rest of it really wasn't. And so once again, these people were forced to eat and consume a diet that created disease. And something that many people don't appreciate is that the disease and illness were part of the plan. They weren't an afterthought. They weren't an unfortunate side effect. They were actually part of the plan. The overseers, the plantation owners wanted these people to be sick. And some people might think, well, that's kind of counterintuitive. If you've got a slave population, you want them to be healthy. No, you don't. You want them to ultimately be sick because you don't want them living into advanced age, because then they become liabilities.
Mhm.
As their productivity declines, if they continue to live for years and years, then they become a drain on your resources. Moreover, if you've got young, healthy men, you want them to be attached to your plantation because they got elderly, sick parents and relatives that they are afraid to leave. And so that whole illness was part of the way you kept that population docile. It was a way you kept them attached to your plantation. It was a way you kept them from rebelling, because they knew that if they tried to run away, if they tried to rebel and fight, their relatives would suffer. And so illness was part of the game plan from day one. And this has continued on even post-slavery, that the continued foisting of unhealthy food on communities of color has been a way of keeping people of color in a subjugated state, because if people are unhealthy, they are unable to fight.
Mhm.
My mantra is Black lives can't matter until Black health matters.
Mhm.
Because if people are sick, if they taking 1,001 medicines, if their heart is weak, if their blood sugar's out of whack, if they're stroking out every other day, they can't fight for their freedom because they don't have their health. Yeah. And so targeting communities of color with these fast food restaurants that, again, sell just grease-laden, salt-laden, unhealthy food that creates disease from day one, is again part of the overall game plan. Now, we all are very familiar with the concept of the school to prison pipeline. That has been talked about now for a couple of generations. Well, a colleague of mine, Dr. Laxman Mopuri, at the recent Midwest Soul Veg Fest, pointed out something that has been staring us all in the face for years, but I hadn't seen it until he actually articulated it. And that is the cafeteria to hospital pipeline. Mm-hmm. And he pointed out that school cafeterias indoctrinate children into the Western diet. They teach all of our children how to consume this grease-laden, meat-heavy, dairy-centered, disease-promoting diet. So that by the time children graduate from high school, they are completely essentially brainwashed into eating all of this fat-heavy, meat-heavy, dairy-heavy food that is typical of Western countries. And not only that, autopsy studies have shown that children as young as 8 years of age are starting to develop fatty streaks in their arteries, the beginnings of coronary artery disease. Mm-hmm. We know that particularly in children of color, we see the beginnings of chronic disease, and that begin to show up as autoimmune problems, hypertension, massive rates of obesity. Within our communities, children as young as 11 and 12 years of age are starting to get so-called adult onset diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and as preteens, because of the consumption of this grotesquely unhealthy food that is being pushed on them in our schools. So schools are indoctrinating children in unhealthy lifestyle habits. And it is all for the benefit of American agribusiness and to our detriment.
That is very well said. Just have to say that, and for a lot of our listeners, I know that they're hearing this just for the very, very first time, and I can just imagine what they're saying, but like, why would the doctors let that happen? Why would the schools let that happen? Why would, if the research is out there that shows that food is medicine, that we need nutrients, like how is this? And what you're talking about, what happened was, through colonization and the, taking over the lands in America. But I mean, it is still happening now. Like the best documentary that just came out recently was They're Trying to Kill Us, which shows us exactly what's happening in so many communities of color where, if a grocery store closes, you're not even allowed, nobody else is allowed to open up a grocery store in that community for another 10 years. Like they have policies now in place to prevent healthy food, grocery stores from being there, but a fast food place can pop up, no problem.
Absolutely. In fact, there are incentives given to fast food restaurateurs to open these franchises in Black and brown communities. And that's why you can go into any Black, Hispanic, and probably Native American neighborhood, and you will find all of, I call it Murderer's Row, Pizza Hut, Papa John's, Wendy's, Burger King, Popeyes, Chick-fil-A. But you go to an affluent white neighborhood, you don't see any of those fast food places. None of them. They are absolutely targeted to communities of color. And you mentioned the colonization. This pattern has been repeated everywhere European colonization has occurred. And it's been done over and over and over, where the colonizers come, they bring their eating patterns with them, and they foist it on the population, and disease and death, higher death rates soon follow. We're unfortunately starting to see that over in China. For years, China, the vast majority of the Chinese population ate a primarily plant-based diet, and most of them lived a more rural existence. As China has industrialized and invited these Western countries in, they've started to, again, get KFC, Burger King, all of these fast food outlets. Their rates of heart disease, strokes, high blood pressure are skyrocketing. But even more distressing and actually mind-blowing, their rates of depression, suicide are also going off the chart, because these things are connected. These diets not only mess up our physiology, they mess up our psychology. And so you see it's, as Humphrey Bogart said, the usual suspects. Or actually it was Claude Rains in Casablanca. You see it's heart disease, high blood pressure, diabetes, obesity, depression, and suicide. They all follow the consumption of animal foods and dairy, because this stuff is unhealthy and it destroys our physiology and psychology.
And I'm really glad that you brought that up, because we haven't done a podcast on this yet. It is something I've been thinking about deeply, especially in Canada. We don't have the gun laws that, well, we have gun laws actually, compared to in the US. And every time I hear of a mass shooting in the US, I always, I want to dive into that person's life who pulled the trigger,
Sure.
right? Because I know there are diet-related conditions there. I bet you we can study their arteries and probably see a lot of, arterial plaque and clogged arteries and stiffness. We can see then that's attributed to depression and not being able to think clearly. And I see it with my clients. My clients often come to me and they are depressed, angry, suicidal to the point, like that day they want to take their life. And then all of a sudden they switch to a plant-based diet, right? That we put them on immediately.
Right.
Their diabetes goes away, their heart disease goes away. But they all come back and they, talk about how they can think clearly. They're not so snappy. They're not angry. They're no longer depressed. They're no longer suicidal. And, and this is something where I fully believe, and I don't know if anybody's done a study on it yet, though, that correlation between our high animal fat and processed food diet, lack of nutrients, so lack of fruits and vegetables, is directly correlated to all of these, mass shootings.
Right. Well, yes, and there definitely has been studies that have looked at these high animal food, high processed food diets, and depression, anxiety disorders. And there have been corresponding studies that have shown that as people move to a more plant-based diet, their risk of depression and anxiety goes down. There are also actually animal studies that have shown changes in brain myelinization, that you can actually show changes in brain architecture in lab animals that are felt to correlate and with resulting changes in the behavior of these lab animals that is believed to correlate with anxiety type behaviors in humans. So there is indirect evidence for that. But I think that direct one-to-one work looking at diet and this sort of mass violence, yes, that's the connection that still needs to be done. But what's really interesting to me is that in these countries where they don't have easy access to guns, but they are adopting Western dietary patterns, what we're now seeing are mass stabbings.
Yes, exactly.
Which is like insane.
Yeah.
That people are grabbing the weapons they have access to commit these mass atrocities. And again, it's the food that seems to be driving people crazy. And we've got to stop and look at this and get off this insane train, because it is really pushing us all in a disastrous direction. And it is clearly the food, because as you pointed out, it is not only the animal foods that are damaging and our arterial function and clogging up our blood vessels, but it's also the corresponding lack of nutrients that we should be getting from the plant foods, and the benefits that we should be getting from all of the nutrients that come from a healthy plant-based diet that these people don't have. And as a result, their brains are just slowly going off kilter.
And you are one of 1 million physicians, approximately, give or take a couple there, one of 1 million physicians right now in the United States where, you've done the research, you practice the lifestyle of a plant-based whole food diet, you understand this history, but, out of all of those other, and I know that there's more physicians in the States that live a lifestyle like you do, thank goodness, for organizations like the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine and Dr. T. Colin Campbell's, Center for Nutrition Studies, et cetera. But it's still very far and few between to find another medical doctor. For all the listeners out here, they could walk right now. Probably, I would say 95% of them could go to their doctor and say, tell me about the relationship between diet and disease. And their doctor would probably say there's no relationship.
And that is sadly and unfortunately true. And the primary reason for that is when I was interviewing for medical school, and I was interviewing at this one particular school, and my interviewer asked me what I was interested in medicine, and I told him, because I knew that I wanted to explore the relationship between diet and disease. That's the whole reason I went into medicine, and I laid that out. He rather glibly said to me, well, you don't want to end up like the dentist. And I looked at him with a puzzled look on my face and said, what do you mean? He said, well, they fluoridated the water and now they have no patients. And exactly. I committed the ultimate faux pas for an interview. I looked horrified, like, did you just say that? And he kind of tried to play it off by saying, well, what I mean is, in Western medicine, we operate from the disease model. That is, we are in the business of treating sick people we are not in the business of trying to keep people from becoming sick. And he was right insofar as that is the way Western medicine developed and the general way it is practiced. But it does not need to be that way, and it does not need to stay that way, because we clearly have enough knowledge now about the origins of disease and the roots of it that we know that we can prevent much of the major chronic diseases that we see by helping people understand the relationship between what they put in their mouths and the diseases that they will ultimately develop. And so I mean, we must change the way that we are practicing medicine, because number one, it's a losing proposition. We are falling steadily behind in terms of the amount of disease versus what we are actually able to effectively treat. And at best, we're putting Band-Aids on problems, but we're not really curing them. Because when a patient comes in with an acute heart attack, for instance, with a blockage in a coronary artery, and we rush them to the cath lab, and the cardiologist puts a wire through that blocked vessel and puts a little wire stent in there and opens it up to relieve that blockage, that will treat the acute problem, but it does not treat the disease. The disease is the accumulation of fat and cholesterol that led to the blockage. That disease is still going on. And if that person does not do something to change his or her lifestyle, once they leave that cath lab, that process will continue apace, and they're only going to develop another blockage somewhere. And yes, you can put them on, expensive drugs like statins, which can slow that process down, but it won't stop it. What will really stop that process is to completely change their diet and to adopt a lifestyle like Dr. Dean Ornish or Caldwell Esselstyn showed, where you can move to an entirely plant-based diet, drop the cholesterol by over 100+ points, decrease the level of inflammation in the body, and you stop injuring the lining of the arteries that lead to the accumulation of the cholesterol and plaques, and you will actually get regression of the blockages that are already there, and the arteries will heal themselves. That is what we need to do. And it turns out that the same diet that will help heal our arteries will also put diabetes into remission. Type 2 diabetes, it is, not type 1. It'll also help lower the risk for developing colon cancer and breast and prostate cancer, pancreatic cancer. It is the same diet that will address all of the major chronic diseases that are afflicting Westerners. And so we really need to take a strong look at the way that we are living our lives, because we're just killing ourselves, and I should say, we're destroying the planet in the process. Because what most people don't understand is that the number one contributor to greenhouse gas emissions is raising animals for human consumption. That creates more greenhouse gases than all of the planes, trains, cars, and ships combined. And that's why I tell people, if you use LED light bulbs, take your little reusable bags to the store, drive a Prius, but still eat meat, you need more fiber in your diet because you're full of it.
It's, and it is true. And, when I hear you talk about all this, and, I've said exactly the same thing. Our food production and distribution system is the biggest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. So it's not just the growing of these, meat animals, the landscape that they take up. It's also like how we transport these like products far, far and wide. That's, contributing to our climate change crisis. So when we think about the disproportionate rates of diabetes, heart disease, depression, autoimmune disorders, things like rheumatoid arthritis, like, stroke, it's
Lupus.
all
Mhm.
like the list is long. Black and Indigenous communities, people of color experience these rates. It's sometimes 4 to 8 times higher, now even going up to 10 times higher rates than non-Indigenous communities. And you talked about the fact that, we have policies in place to prevent individuals from accessing quality of foods. But then we're also simultaneously talking about, we have the knowledge, like we know what to do. We know how to do it. We know how to reverse these diseases. So what is happening? Is it a lack of knowledge in BIPOC communities? Is it just too long of a history of now eating these colonized, westernized, forced upon them foods? Like there's so many barriers that are in place. And for anybody like me, like, we do a research project like this, and, often it's like, let's develop a policy moving forward. Let's put together a plan or a workbook or, a systems, a strategic plan to like address the issues. But, as I've learned through doing these interviews, the issues are systemic, right?
Sure.
So knowledge is one of them. Like, I'd love to hear what you have to say about that. And then what other factors are there beyond potentially the lack of knowledge?
Well, I think knowledge is huge, and it's absolutely key, because much of this knowledge does not filter down to our communities. And when you look at the advertising that blasted into our communities, it is all designed to direct us to eat garbage. I mean, you turn the vectors of information into our community are radio, television, church, and printed and social media. But what do you see on those things? You see Popeyes, you see Chick-fil-A, you see, depending on where you live, churches, KFC. Those are the things that you see telling people, this is what you should eat. This is what you should feed your families. This is what a meal consists of. This is what's affordable. And they even try to imply that it's healthy. When it comes to feeding our children, a very large percentage of our children participate in the National School Lunch Program. What are they fed in school? They are fed a food that, again, centers around meat and dairy and fat. Right now, I am working with several different groups, and we are actively trying to petition the USDA to provide a non-dairy option for children of color, so that they will not be forced to take cow's milk on their school lunch tray. And that is just a very simple step. But when you realize that when it comes to minority children, 75 to 95% of Black, Asian, Hispanic, Native American children are lactose intolerant relative to only about 30% of white children. That means that when children of color are given milk, they're going to get sick. So that means that when our children go out and eat lunch, while the white kids are able to study all afternoon with no problem, children of color are going to be experiencing significant gastrointestinal distress. They're going to have cramps. They're going to have diarrhea. They're going to have stomach upset. And there's no way they can focus on their studies if they're sick all afternoon. Mm-hmm. Whereas the white kids have no problem. And then again, when they're eating all of this fat and cholesterol and grease, it's again laying the foundations of disease that's going to affect them as they move through their lives. The fact that these diets are so heavily weighted in dairy really troubles me as an African-American man, because prostate cancer is at epidemic proportions in the Black community. Black men have a 70% higher rate of prostate cancer than white men. And once we're diagnosed, we are more than twice as likely to die from it. Dairy consumption is the leading risk factor for prostate cancer. So foisting this crap on our children is setting them up for disease. Mm-hmm. And the only reason to do it is not nutrition. It is so that dairy producers can pimp our children for profit, and that is inexcusable. The US government and the USDA has known for over 60 years the prevalence of lactose intolerance among our children. And the only reason they will not reverse that rule is so that these people can keep making money off our children. And that is the quintessential example of systemic and structural racism.
And you were telling me that for these parents who know that they don't want their children having the dairy, they have to go get a doctor's note, you were saying, if they want to be able to give them a plant-based milk.
Yes. By law, if a minority parent wants their child to have something other than dairy, they are required to take that child to a doctor and get a doctor's letter saying their child has to have something other than dairy. Now, let me make it clear. Number one, even if they get that letter, that doesn't guarantee that the child will get something other than dairy. Because once they turn that letter over to the school system then has to try and come up with the money to buy something other than cow's milk for that child. But when you realize how schools purchase their milk, they purchase their milk from large suppliers. So here they are with this one little piece of letter from a doctor for this one child. They're not gonna, their large suppliers not gonna give them, a couple of cartons of soy milk for this one child. So even that letter doesn't guarantee that that child will have of what he or she needs. Moreover, participation in the school lunch program is needs-based, meaning that these are poor families. So you are forcing poor people to spend money on a doctor visit that is totally unnecessary, because being lactose intolerant is normal for people of color. Being Black, being Hispanic, being Native American is not a disease. How dare you require these poor people to spend money for something that is normal for them? And then what if a mother has 4 children in school? You're telling me she's got to spend money on 4 different doctor's visits? That's horrific. It is so racist, it makes my head spin. Yeah. But this is what our government is willing to do to poor people of color, just so that they can still give money to these white dairy producers. That is unconscionable, and it needs to stop now.
Yeah, we live in a society now, like we go back 100 years to 1920. I mean, if you compare the number of policies and laws that were in place there, like, like we have so many policies, a policy that prevents a child from being able to get, plant-based milk in a school lunch program, a policy forcing someone to go get a doctor's note as opposed to the mom, like whether or not the child is lactose intolerant. You should be able to say, I don't want to drink cow's milk because I have knowledge. I should just be able to present a scientific study and say, hey, you know what? Cow's milk isn't good for anybody. So, let's not consume it. But we have these policies in place, and that's a huge, massive barrier to anybody getting healthy.
Exactly. And the reason that policy was put in place was precisely to make it difficult for the parents to opt out.
Yeah.
And that's something I'm glad you mentioned that, because this is something I want to point out to people, is that the National School Lunch Program was created in 1946. And it was created not because the government was concerned about the health and welfare of children. It was created because at the end of World War II, all of a sudden they had all of this excess dairy production, and they were afraid that if they didn't do something with it, the bottom was going to drop out of the dairy market, and it would cause a recession. So they said, you know what? Let's dump it into the schools. The issue was that the schools were segregated. Brown versus the Board of Education didn't pass the Supreme Court till 1954. So in 1946, nobody gave a damn about children of color. Nobody thought about children of color. So they didn't care about giving cow's milk to Black, Brown, Hispanic, Native American kids, because they weren't part of the picture then. But we are now, and that's why things have to change.
Mm-hmm. No, exactly. And, this part about the, so policies, okay, we got to break down these policies. We've got to completely change them entirely. I keep coming back to the knowledge, though, as being one of the potential, like a huge, massive barrier. The fact that the knowledge is not even getting through to communities of color, because of course they're using people of color in the advertisements to market the fast foods, like you said, saying that they're cheap and but there's this other element that's sitting with me right now that I'd love for you to speak with. When an African American mom, throws a gathering, a party to celebrate the granddad or the kid or, whoever it is, and then you look at the food that's on the table. The food that's on the table is considered culturally appropriate, but it's like fried chicken or like grits with tons of milk and tons of dairy and tons of butter. And so it's not even just knowledge, it's the type of knowledge, the historical knowledge, that awareness that, right now we have this huge movement, white people promoting plant-based diets and making a lot of money off of it as though it's this new thing that they just discovered. Whereas history shows us people of color were predominantly plant-based. In fact, if you were Irish, Scottish, English, German, you pretty much ate predominantly plants because we didn't have industrialized meat farms.
That's exactly right. And that goes double if you were a person of color. That prior to colonization, people of color ate a predominantly plant-based diet. These so-called soul food diets, or the ethnic cuisines that we typically identify as Mexican food, Chinese food, Thai food, those are post-colonization versions of those cuisines that have been modified to appeal to Europeans. And so they feature a lot more meat. They feature dairy, which were not a part of any truly pre-colonization ethnic cuisine. Dairy was brought by Europeans. And prior to, again, colonization, true ethnic cuisines featured very little meat, if any, and were primarily built around healthy plant foods. a more traditional version of an ethnic cuisine is if you have ever eaten at an Ethiopian restaurant, where you've got this huge platter that has just this wide assortment of various plant foods that you can eat from and sample from, with with breads and so forth. That is much closer to a truly authentic ethnic cuisine than what people are used to when they think of ethnic cuisines nowadays, because what we have been taught to think of as ethnic food now is really bastardized post-colonization, corrupted forms of food that just creates excess disease.
Exactly. And I mean, I'm part Indian, South Asian, part African, Malawian, part Austrian. And, even, my dad, Austrian, when I first met him when I was 25 years old, my biological dad, and went to a family dinner in Austria. I got to meet all these relatives I didn't know about, and the whole table was just pure meat. And, but my dad had heart disease, had all of these things. And, but then he started learning about this, like his own culture, his own Austrian culture, and realized, he's like, we never used to eat a whole table of meat. Or like, if you're Brazilian, you go to these Brazilian restaurants and the whole entire thing, it's like how much meat, like 10 different types of meat on your plate. But that might have only been if there was an abundance of meat for a very short period of time. But the other 365 days a year, people in Brazil were eating plants.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. This is a huge, huge barrier, is that, just lack of awareness of our own cultures, our own histories, which I love, which brings me to the fact that we just created a course called Decolonizing Your Plate. You just created and launched a program called Decolonizing
Your diet.
your
Yes.
diet. But
Decolonize your diet. Yes.
Yeah. And then you took it one step further in our conversation that we had last time, where you said it goes beyond decolonizing our diet or our plate to decolonizing our
mindset.
Yeah.
Exactly. Because even our idea of what constitutes a meal has been completely colonized. And I'm glad you were talking about your dad, speaking of, as an Austrian, even acknowledging that traditional diets for Austrians didn't consist of just a dinner table full of dead animals, because in medieval times, a peasant could be put to death for, quote, killing the king's deer. It was felt that animals belonged to the gentry, to the wealthy, the landed gentry, and peasants lived literally a plant-based existence. And if they were found to have shot and killed a deer or some other large animal, they literally could be put to death. And what that meant was that if they ate meat, it was rarely and typically on holidays or festive occasions. And that is why animal foods and animal eating took on such cachet, if you will. But what happened then is that people came to look upon the gathering around this dead corpse as something to be desired, and as these European habits were sort of passed around the world, that practice of building your meal around a corpse became the standard, to the point that we now think of a proper meal as being centered around a dead animal. And essentially all of our meals are funerals.
We celebrate with exactly.
Right.
Celebrate with funerals.
It's one of the most unhealthy ways of eating, because we are sitting around eating dead, rotting, necrotic flesh that when we ingest it, it creates toxins and disease, and essentially starts the process of breaking down our own bodies. And it is not the way we should be eating. It is not what our genes have are accustomed to, and it, again, over time, leads to the breakdown of our tissues, promotes cancer, heart disease, diabetes, you name it, all sorts of chronic diseases. And so, yes, we need to not only decolonize our diet, we need to decolonize our mindset. We need to decolonize our way of relating to the world, because the way that we are interacting with our planet is destroying our planet.
Yeah.
We are wrecking ecosystems. We are destroying entire the rainforest and other natural systems, and this is just it's non-sustainable. You know, prior to European colonization, New World peoples lived for millennia in harmony with their environments. But in the last 600 years of the so-called age of exploration, which it was really the age of exploitation, we have practically driven the world off a cliff. And if we don't stop it, we won't be here for very long.
No, and it's true. And it's, and these, are not just words that are flying out randomly. Like, these are not just opinions of yours. These are true facts that are found in every, our medical literature is, it is overrun with this kind of information that has shown us, not just right now in the last 5 years. Anybody who wakes up right now and says, oh my gosh, do you know what we just discovered? No, we knew all of these things that you're saying, I'm saying 25, 35 years ago. Like, even the medical doctor that I, teach his therapy, it's 100-year-old therapy from 1918. And, Dr. Gerson said the same thing. If we don't stop using fertilizers and pesticides in 100 years from now, so 2018, he said we would see cancer rates be 1 in 2 people would be diagnosed with cancer. And that is exactly where we are now. And so it's not new information.
Absolutely.
It is facts that have been there. So one of the things that you haven't touched on yet, but that has come up in the other interviews is, and let me just preface this with, the reason I'm doing this research is because I saw the gap in the literature, massive gaps in the literature. Every time the literature was talking about diseases amongst people of color, they said it was the cause of it was obesity, lack of exercise, bad diet, but then didn't say what a good diet was, right? So what's this bad diet? Often things like not enough protein and not enough, but like no understanding of what even a good diet is. So obesity, alcoholism, lack of exercise, bad diet. And when I looked at this and I was like, no, these are not the root causes. These are the systemic causes. And that's what I want to get into. So one of the things that we haven't quite touched on yet is, around trauma. And just curious, like, what your thoughts are on that. We talked about knowledge, we talked about policies being in place, education, everything.
There was a really important article that appeared in the Atlantic a few years ago that looked at how trauma can be imprinted on our genes. So one of the most important areas of science that has emerged in the last 20 years is the science of epigenetics. And when Watson and Crick discovered the DNA molecule as being the engine of genetic transference. And people began to understand how DNA worked, how it was passed down from parent to child. The scientists came to the conclusion that DNA was set in stone, that the DNA that you got from your parents was solid, rigid. It was unmodifiable by anything that you did in your life. And we now know that while the DNA itself cannot be changed by your life experiences or habits, the way your DNA is transcribed can be. And that's because our DNA is wrapped around these proteins called histone proteins. And those histone proteins can be modified by both the food that we eat and our life's experiences. And studies on Holocaust survivors have shown that experiences that Holocaust survivors have had, that exposures to certain entities, I mean, pictures or buildings or experiences, that their grandchildren can see a picture, a building, a railway car, and will have a visceral physiologic reaction to something they had never seen before, because that that experience was imprinted on their DNA from their grandparents through epigenetic effects. We know that studies on Hispanic mothers who have been subjected to racist abuse causes changes in, if they are pregnant and carrying a baby, it actually causes demonstrable changes in the genes in the babies that they're carrying. And it makes it more likely that they may go into preterm labor. When the babies are born, the babies are more likely to have certain metabolic problems. So there is no question but that a lot of the metabolic and health issues that we see in people of color are caused by the societal trauma and problems that they are subjected to in these societies. That has been proven time and time again. And then you superimpose that upon the fact that they are often confined and deliberately confined into areas where they don't have access to healthy food choices, to decent health care, and are subjected to relentless social trauma and abuse. All of these things combine to literally create, exacerbate, and perpetuate the disease that we see. So I have absolutely no patience whatsoever for the arrogance, ignorance, and racist habit of blaming victims for the abuse and trauma that we visit on them, that create the problems that we see them struggling to deal with.
Thank you. Thank you. And that is something that does need to be brought up at the, policy level, because we go
Time
in
and
there.
time again. Yes.
Yeah, we just, and we see it all the time. My mom has been told 100 times, if not more, they just say lose weight. That's like, you need to lose weight. It's your fault. You need to lose weight,
Right.
as opposed to, whoa, 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 whoa. Like, let's actually understand this individual's narrative, their stories, their history, like, let's look at all of those things first. And then, let's talk about that. Let's get that understanding, and then the weight will naturally fall off. Like, I see that happen all the time. My clients, they learn their history, they learn how to get connected to their ancestors and their ancestors' food, and then they eat the food, and then, you know,
Exactly.
and they feel empowered to know their history as well, and to know how that affects them. But right now, like, what's happening, it's yeah, and even worse in the States, because the levels of obesity in the States are
Off the
so
chart.
high, off the
And
charts.
and yeah, and I would like to tell those doctors, how about if I just give you nothing but a plate full of Lunchables and tell you to lose weight? Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
being told to exercise as though, there's time to go to the gym. Like, when you're juggling 2 jobs,
oh my
you have to
God.
go take a bus for 3 hours to go get your food,
Okay.
like, to try and get any kind of healthy food. And, then on top of that, you're being told that their disease has nothing to do with their diet, but, "Hey, go exercise." Right? And that's,
Uh,
yeah.
Yes, 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 I actually, I feel myself working on an ulcer when I think about these things.
No, I hear you, and I do too. This is the kind of stuff that keeps me up at night. And, when I think about, I like to always imagine the med school of the future, and what would we teach in the med school of the future that would actually truly be a med school that promotes healthcare, not the sick care system that we're in. And, these are the things that I dream about, right? It's
Right.
it's narrative medicine, it's understanding our oral histories, it is understanding the trauma and abuse, understanding geography, like, where do you live in relationship to your food, all of these things, and in that's when we can actually come up with the solutions that would help all people heal, because we're only as sick, I say this all the time, we're only as sick or as healthy as the sickest person in our community.
Yes, and that we tell the doctors, it is your responsibility to help them solve the problem.
Yeah.
It is not acceptable for you to sit in your air-conditioned office and pontificate and feel like you've done something.
Yeah.
That's not enough. You haven't done anything. If you the you got to be solutions oriented. And if you haven't helped get, a couple steps closer to a solution, you are a failure.
Mm,
Period. That's the bottom line.
yeah.
We're solutions oriented. And if we haven't come up with a solution, you failed. How about that?
I love that. Yeah, nobody wants to be a failure.
Right.
I know.
Right. And we've got to stop letting people off the hook. You
Yeah.
know, letting people just sit up and blame victims and feel like they've accomplished something. No, that's not
Yeah.
acceptable.
Yeah. No, it's
No,
not
it's like you take your car to the dealership and he looks under the hood and says, "Oh, your piston's busted." Closes the hood and says, "Okay, you're done."
yeah.
You're gonna go, "No,
Yeah.
he's supposed to fix that."
You shouldn't have let your piston get busted. Like,
Right,
those,
yes,
that's what, you shouldn't have gained so much weight. You shouldn't
right,
have,
yeah,
eaten that food. And
right.
yeah, no, it's definitely not the way to go. Um, you have shared, I mean, so much wisdom, the history, just this in itself is part of that solution. It's getting your words into this podcast. Other people can listen to it. They can understand their own histories, understand that really tumultuous journey that has brought us here, especially, particularly people of color. But also to know that if you're listening to this and you're not a person of color, if you look at your skin and you are white or pink or whatever color you are, this collective history is affecting you as well, because the chronic disease rates among non-Indigenous members are astronomically high, and they do not need to be.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
I just, yeah, any last thoughts there that you want to share with us? Is there anything that we didn't touch on with regards to all the barriers that are preventing people of color from being healthy, or do you want to address some of the opportunities that may exist?
Yeah, well, yeah, there's a couple things that I always like to tell people. And number one, I always want my audiences to know, I talk about how bad the Western lifestyle is for people of color. But I tell people, I don't want anybody to leave my session and say, Dr. Mills said the Western lifestyle is bad for people of color, but white people get a pass. No, you don't.
No.
The difference is jumping off a 75-story building without a parachute versus jumping off a 50-story building without a parachute. Both are going to die. It's just somebody's going to make a bigger splat. So it's not good for anybody. Okay. That's number one. Number two, whenever you start talking about changing diet, there's a moment where everybody feels panic, because we all think about, oh my God, but I like, but I'm used to, but I want. Because we've all grown up eating a certain way. I know, because I was in that boat once and I felt it. I remind people, none of us had a conversation with the obstetrician when we were born. My point, we were all born without preferences. Everything we think we like, we were taught to like.
Yeah.
And just as we were taught to like things that were not good for us, we can unlearn those bad habits and learn new ones. Most people are in relationships, but they're not in relationships with the first person they fell in love with. Why? That person did something stupid and they said, why am I with this fool? And they got rid of that person and got somebody else. And just as you learn to love someone else, you can learn to love something else. And once you learn you love something, you love it. And so we've got to learn to love things that are good for us, good for the planet, and that don't harm other beings. So that's just it.
That's just it, folks. That is just it. Break up with those unhealthy habits that aren't serving
Absolutely.
you. Yeah, that's
That's
not
like
loving you
a
up.
knucklehead boyfriend or girlfriend.
Exactly. You know what? Like I said, this has been awesome, because I said, from all these beautiful, pieces that are coming out from all the participants that have been in this study, like we can create a course on it, write a book on it, like do a workshop on it. Like, and this is definitely going to be the title of one of my workshops, is like break up with that knucklehead, that unhealthy food habit.
Knucklehead diet. Yes.
Yes, exactly. Oh my gosh. Dr. Mills, you have been an absolute pleasure, such a wealth of information. Your energy is contagious, your passion, your anger, your love. You did mention, and I'll close off with this, you said people of color are just too sick to have that energy to fight. And so, if anything, to be able to have the energy that you have, to be able to have that fight in you to keep going and fight for kids to get plant-based milks in schools and all the other things that you do, the countless things that you do. If anybody's listening to this, switch your diet now, because you will get that energy so that you can have the fight and you can be doing this good work that you are doing too, and supporting Dr. Mills.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being on our show. And everyone else, we'll see you next time.
My pleasure. All right. Take care.